Welcome to USA Report. The moment Savannah Guthrie's latest video began playing, there was a heaviness in the air that couldn't be measured in seconds, but an emotion suspended like a storm cloud ready to break. Because this was not another press briefing, not another edited statement read off a teleprompter. It was raw, urgent, and unfiltered. A plea to move things forward, to bridge the gap between fear and hope, and to reach into the very uncertainty that has gripped the nation since her mother, 84-year-old Nancy Guthrie, vanished without a trace. And from that first gaze into the camera, where Savannah's eyes searched seemingly for more than just support, but for answers that had stubbornly refused to emerge, the world felt the tension settle deep into its bones. In that opening moment, she did not offer platitudes or rehearsed lines. She offered truth. The truth of desperation, of devotion, and of a daughter staring into the unknown and refusing to look away. And it is precisely this vulnerability, tempered with resilience, that compels attention. Because when someone with Savannah's poise and professional discipline reveals raw emotion, it signals that something is deeply unresolved, something that no amount of news coverage or official statement has yet explained. The controversial urgency in her voice was palpable, not frantic, but sharpened by time and pressure, as she thanked the public for their prayers and support, and then pivoted into a direct appeal for help, telling anyone with information, no matter how small or distant, to speak up, because law enforcement was working around the clock, yet still lacked the crucial lead that could begin to unravel the mystery of Nancy's disappearance. This was not just a narrative pivot, it was a shift in energy, a transition from passive hope to active seeking. A psychological leap that turns every viewer from a distant observer into a potential source of insight. Her words were simple, yet the underlying stakes were anything but. A mother missing, a family fractured, and a public caught between empathy and suspense, all waiting, watching, and wondering what lies beyond the frame of that video. NBC4 Washington. There was an instinctive conflict visible in her demeanor, a blend of gratitude and urgency that humanizes the otherwise clinical flow of news bulletins and timelines. She spoke of prayer and hope, invoking faith as both solace and strategy, and in doing so, she allowed an emotional complexity that few public figures ever expose in crises of this magnitude. In that vulnerability lay a kind of clarity. She wasn't performing courage, she was breathing it into every word, and as analysts of human behavior would note, the cultivated calm was not absence of fear, but mastery of it, a conscious choice to steady her voice so that her message would travel further, land deeper, and carry more weight. The psychological dimension of this appeal cannot be ignored. People in the grips of crisis often oscillate between hope and despair, yet Savannah's video suggested something more, a refusal to be paralyzed by uncertainty, a calculated effort to engage symptoms rather than succumb to them. When she urged people to look for anything that seemed strange and to report it, she was effectively mobilizing the public's memory and attention, turning collective vigilance into a decentralized search grid, multiplying the eyes and ears on the possible trail of her missing mother. This is not random messaging. This is strategic outreach born from instinct and heartbreak, the kind of messaging that comes when internal hope is fused with external necessity. In the background of her plea is a story that has both hardened and softened with time. Hardened by the brutal facts of missing persons cases that resist neat resolution, and softened by the warmth of communal support, prayer vigils, and digital solidarity from thousands who have watched the situation evolve. Every teardrop a stranger shares, every prayer whispered in distant towns, adds a layer of emotional complexity that news headlines cannot capture. And in Savannah's plea, these threads of shared humanity were woven subtly into her message, not as exposition, but as proof that the connective tissue of empathy can sometimes reach deeper than the cold logic of investigation. Meanwhile, commentators and contributors across media platforms, including outlets where Paul Morrow and others parse every angle of the social narrative, have highlighted this latest video as more than a plea. It is a call to action, a psychological trigger that transforms passive concern into actionable urgency. And that transformation shifts the entire landscape of the case from a family's private grief to a national, multifaceted search for truth and resolution. Here, the story transcends the confines of a missing person report. It becomes a cultural moment, one where personal pain intersects with public curiosity and where every viewer is left to grapple with their own response to someone's worst fear laid bare in front of millions. As the early seconds of this video continue to circulate, the emotional temperature of the public conversation rises in tandem, blending empathy with tension, hope with fear, And that blend is what makes this narrative so compelling, so necessary, and so impossible to look away from. Every silence in the search is a question unanswered. Every step toward progress is a minor triumph. And in Savannah's plea, there is an echo of a universal truth. When human beings confront uncertainty with urgency and love, they reveal not weakness, but a deeply rooted resilience that invites others to bear witness and perhaps to act. This opening segment doesn't just set the tone. It forces the viewer to inhabit it, to feel the desperation and hope simultaneously, and to recognize that this story, as it unfolds, is not merely observed, but experienced. Not passively digested, but actively lived through each plea for help, each shared moment of vulnerability, and each echo of faith that maybe, just maybe, someone out there holds the key to bringing Nancy Guthrie home. As Savannah Guthrie's plea continued to ripple outward, something subtle but powerful began to happen in the public psyche, because this was no longer just a missing person alert competing for attention in an endless news cycle. It was a human story anchoring itself in emotion, and that shift matters, because when people emotionally invest, they don't just watch. They remember, they notice details, they replay timelines in their minds, and they question things they might otherwise ignore. And this is where the gravity of Savannah's appeal deepens, because her calm, controlled delivery contrasts sharply with the chaos such a disappearance creates behind closed doors, a contrast that signals not denial, but resolve, the kind forged when fear has been processed into purpose. Behavioral analysts often point out that when a person chooses composure in moments of crisis, it is not because they feel less, but because they feel so much that losing control would blur the message. And Savannah's steady tone suggests a conscious decision to prioritize clarity over collapse, to ensure that every word could be absorbed, remembered, and acted upon. Behind that composure lies an unspoken countdown, because time in cases like this does not move neutrally. It either works for you or against you, and every passing hour adds weight to uncertainty, which is why her message carries an undercurrent of urgency even when her voice does not rise. She speaks not as a broadcaster but as a daughter, and that distinction reshapes how viewers interpret every pause, every inhale, every carefully chosen phrase, because they sense the internal battle between hope and dread, a battle she refuses to let define the outcome. This psychological balancing act, projecting hope while confronting fear, is often seen in families who understand that despair shuts doors while belief, however fragile, keeps them open, and Savannah's words function almost like a bridge between those two states, inviting the public to stand with her in the space between not knowing and still believing. Public reaction to this second wave of appeals reflects that shift as conversations online move away from speculation and toward vigilance, with people sharing memories, locations, timelines, and even unrelated anomalies they suddenly reconsider in light of her words. This is the quiet power of a well-timed plea. It reframes ordinary experiences into potential clues, turning routine observations into moments of heightened awareness. Psychologically, this collective attention creates a kind of distributed search effort where thousands of minds hold fragments of the same question, increasing the odds that something overlooked may surface, and Savannah's appeal seems designed to spark exactly that response without tipping into panic or sensationalism. There is also a deeper emotional layer at play, one that rarely makes headlines but shapes how stories like this unfold, and that is the role of faith and community as stabilizing forces. When Savannah references prayer and gratitude, she is not retreating into abstraction. She is grounding herself and her audience in continuity, reminding them that even when facts are scarce, meaning and connection still exist. For many viewers, this resonates deeply because it mirrors how people cope with their own uncertainties, and that shared resonance strengthens engagement, transforming sympathy into solidarity. In this sense, the video becomes more than an update. It becomes a shared ritual of hope, replayed, reshared, and internalized by people who may never meet the family but feel bound to the outcome. As analysts and commentators dissect her words and demeanor, another reality becomes clear. This case now exists at the intersection of private pain and public responsibility, where every viewer must decide whether to remain passive or to act, even if action means nothing more than staying alert or passing the message forward. Savannah's appeal subtly assigns that responsibility without accusation, framing participation as compassion rather than obligation, and that framing lowers resistance while increasing involvement. It is a delicate psychological strategy, whether intentional or instinctive, and it reflects an understanding that people are more likely to help when they feel invited, not pressured. What lingers most from this stage of the story is not fear, but tension infused with resolve. The sense that while answers remain elusive, the search itself has intensified, sharpened by emotion and collective focus. Savannah's message does not promise resolution, but it refuses surrender, and that refusal becomes contagious, seeding determination in viewers who now carry the story with them into their daily lives. As the search continues and silence stretches, this second phase marks a turning point where the narrative shifts from waiting to watching closely, from hoping quietly to looking actively, and in that shift lies the possibility, fragile but real, that somewhere someone will connect a detail, recall a moment, or recognize a sign that leads closer to the truth. As the story moves forward, the atmosphere around the case begins to change in a way that is almost invisible unless you know what to look for. Because this is the phase where pressure quietly builds rather than explodes, where investigators, media figures, and even the public start reassessing what they thought they understood. And Savannah Guthrie's plea becomes less about asking for help and more about sustaining momentum. In cases like this, momentum is everything because silence is not neutral, it is corrosive, and every day without new information risks dulling public attention, which is why continued visibility becomes a strategy rather than a reaction. Savannah's presence, controlled and consistent, functions as a reminder that the case is still alive, unresolved, and demanding accountability from anyone who might know more than they are saying. Media analysts often note that when a family member steps forward repeatedly, especially with a calm but unwavering tone, it subtly shifts the burden of silence onto others. The question becomes no longer what happened, but who is still withholding something, and that psychological reframing matters because people who possess even minor, seemingly irrelevant details may suddenly feel the weight of conscience more heavily. Savannah's approach does not accuse, but it narrows the moral space in which silence feels comfortable, and that is often when cracks begin to form. Someone remembers a conversation that felt odd, a vehicle that seemed out of place, a moment they dismissed too quickly, and those memories resurface not because of fear, but because the story refuses to fade. At this stage, former law enforcement voices like Paul Morrow and Josh Ritter become especially relevant, not because they promise answers, but because they understand patterns, and patterns tell stories long before facts do. They talk about timing, about the language used in pleas, about what is said and what is conspicuously avoided. And through that lens, Savannah's video reads as intentional rather than emotional, measured rather than reactive. That intentionality suggests coordination, not in a conspiratorial sense, but in a strategic one, where the family and investigators understand that certain messages must be repeated until they land with the right person. This is not about spectacle. It is about persistence. There is also an internal shift happening within the audience, one that transforms passive viewers into quiet participants. When people watch a case unfold over time, especially one framed through personal appeals, they begin to mentally rehearse scenarios, asking themselves what they would do if they knew something, if they were afraid, if they were complicit through inaction. This mental rehearsal is powerful because it lowers the psychological barrier to coming forward. The fear of being involved is gradually replaced by the fear of remaining silent, and Savannah's continued visibility accelerates that process without ever explicitly demanding it. Emotionally, this is often the hardest phase for families because hope has to be actively maintained rather than instinctively felt. Early on, hope is fueled by shock and urgency. Later, it must be rebuilt daily in the face of uncertainty. Savannah's steady demeanor suggests an understanding of this reality, an acceptance that strength now means endurance. She is not trying to shock the public into action. She is trying to keep them engaged long enough for truth to surface, and that patience is both strategic and deeply personal. What also becomes clearer in this phase is the unspoken tension between what the public knows and what investigators may already suspect. Law enforcement rarely reveals everything, especially when they believe pressure and time may do more work than disclosure. Savannah's plea, viewed through this lens, may serve a dual purpose: keeping the public alert while signaling to those involved that the search has not stalled, that scrutiny remains intense, and that the window for coming forward on one's own terms is slowly closing. By the end of this part of the story, the case feels heavier, not because of new revelations, but because of accumulated awareness. Every repeated plea, every analysis, every shared clip adds weight to the silence surrounding unanswered questions. Savannah's voice, steady and persistent, becomes a metronome, marking time, reminding everyone that this story is not finished, that waiting is not the same as forgetting, and that somewhere within the expanding circle of attention, the truth is being pressed closer to the surface. By the time a case reaches this stage, the most revealing elements are often no longer found in new evidence, but in behavior, repetition, and the subtle shifts in how messages are delivered, received, and reframed. And this is where analysts begin paying closer attention to tone rather than words, cadence rather than content. Savannah Guthrie's continued appearances carry a consistency that feels deliberate, almost disciplined, and in high-profile missing person cases, that discipline is rarely accidental. It suggests guidance, preparation, and an understanding that every public moment is not just communication, but leverage, a way of quietly influencing both public perception and private decision-making among those who may be watching far more closely than they admit. Behavioral experts often point out that when a family member maintains composure over time, it can signal two very different things to different audiences, and that duality is exactly what makes it powerful. To the public, calm reads as strength and credibility, reinforcing trust and empathy, while to anyone involved or adjacent to the situation, it can read as resolve, a signal that panic has been replaced by persistence, and that pressure will not simply dissolve with time. Savannah's demeanor never feels performative. Instead, it feels anchored, as if she understands that emotional volatility might briefly spike attention, but emotional steadiness sustains it, and sustained attention is what ultimately forces movement. Media narratives also begin to subtly evolve during this phase, shifting from breaking news to unresolved urgency. And that shift matters more than most viewers realize. When anchors, commentators, and former law enforcement figures frame a story as ongoing rather than fading, it resists the natural news cycle's tendency to move on. Savannah's video plea fits neatly into this evolution, not reigniting the story with shock, but reinforcing it with relevance, reminding audiences that time passing does not equate to progress made. This framing keeps the case psychologically open, unresolved in a way that invites continued scrutiny rather than quiet resignation. There is also a quieter, more uncomfortable dynamic at play, one that analysts like Paul Morrow and Josh Ritter often hint at without explicitly stating, and that is the idea that someone somewhere may be waiting for the right moment to speak. Human behavior under pressure is rarely immediate. People delay, rationalize, hope consequences will lessen with time, but sustained exposure disrupts that strategy. Every new plea resets the clock emotionally, reminding potential witnesses or participants that the moment has not passed, that the moral and legal weight of silence continues to accumulate rather than fade. From an investigative perspective, this phase is often about observation rather than action, watching how narratives ripple outward, and where resistance appears strongest. Law enforcement understands that public messaging can provoke reactions even when no direct response is given, and those reactions, shifts in routine, changes in communication, sudden movements, can be as telling as a confession. Savannah's steady presence contributes to this environment of observation, creating conditions where anomalies stand out more clearly against an otherwise consistent backdrop. For the audience, engagement deepens in a different way now, moving beyond curiosity into emotional investment. Viewers who have followed the story begin to feel a sense of responsibility, sharing clips, discussing theories, urging awareness, not because they expect immediate resolution, but because unresolved stories create a kind of moral tension. Savannah's continued advocacy taps into that tension, reinforcing the idea that staying engaged is not voyeurism, but participation in keeping the search alive, in refusing to let uncertainty become invisibility. As this part of the story closes, what becomes most striking is not what has been revealed, but what remains deliberately unresolved. Savannah's plea, calm yet insistent, sits at the center of that unresolved space, functioning less as a question and more as a challenge to time itself. It suggests that answers are not absent, only delayed, and that with each passing day of sustained attention, the cost of withholding truth grows heavier, making eventual disclosure not just likely, but inevitable. As the case moves deeper into this phase, the tension no longer comes from sudden developments, but from the slow, grinding pressure of unanswered questions. And this is often the point where stories either quietly disappear or stubbornly refuse to let go of public consciousness. What makes the Guthrie case feel different is that it continues to resist fading, largely because the messaging around it remains focused, human, and emotionally disciplined. Savannah Guthrie's latest video does not chase sympathy or dramatics. Instead, it projects endurance. And endurance is unsettling because it suggests the search is far from over, even if visible progress appears limited. Behind the scenes, former investigators frequently describe this stage as a psychological waiting game, where time is used as a tool rather than an enemy. Law enforcement understands that people who know something often believe silence will eventually protect them, that public attention will shift and consequences will soften, but sustained visibility disrupts that belief. Savannah's repeated composed appeals serve as reminders that attention has not waned, that scrutiny is steady, and that whatever comfort silence once offered is slowly being stripped away. This is not aggressive pressure, but persistent presence, and it can be far more effective. Media analysis during this period often centers on what is not being said, both by officials and by those close to the situation. Analysts notice that Savannah avoids speculation, avoids emotional extremes, and avoids language that could close doors prematurely. That restraint is significant because it leaves space for information to come forward without fear of immediate judgment or backlash. In other words, the message feels open rather than accusatory, inviting rather than cornering, which is often exactly what hesitant witnesses need in order to step forward. There is also a growing awareness among viewers that cases like this are not solved by a single dramatic breakthrough, but by the accumulation of small, often overlooked details. A memory resurfaces, a conversation is re-examined, a timeline is questioned, and those pieces slowly begin to align. Savannah's continued visibility reinforces the idea that no detail is too small, that even delayed information still matters, and that coming forward late is still better than never coming forward at all. This reframing reduces the shame barrier that often keeps people silent. Emotionally, this phase tests resolve in ways that are difficult to articulate because hope must coexist with frustration, and determination must survive without validation. Savannah's presence suggests an understanding of this emotional complexity, a willingness to carry uncertainty without letting it dictate behavior. That kind of composure does not erase pain, it channels it into something functional, something that keeps the search moving forward even when progress feels invisible. From a strategic standpoint, continued public engagement also serves to protect the integrity of the case. When attention remains high, misinformation is more likely to be challenged, rumors are scrutinized, and false narratives struggle to take root. Savannah's calm, consistent messaging anchors the story, giving the public a reliable point of reference amid speculation. This anchoring effect is crucial because it preserves credibility and ensures that when real developments occur, they are recognized as such rather than dismissed as noise. As this part of the story draws to a close, the case feels suspended in a state of deliberate tension, held there by persistence rather than panic. Savannah's plea continues to echo, not loudly, but steadily, reinforcing the idea that time alone will not resolve this, that truth requires pressure, patience, and participation. The search, in this sense, is no longer just an investigation. It is a collective act of refusal to let uncertainty win.